The following program contains images that may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Along a busy stretch of Roswell Road in Marietta, north of Atlanta, bordered on one side by Interstate 75 and on another side by a restaurant parking lot, a sidewalk through a patch of grass leads to three memorials. A man named Leo Frank, a Jew, was lynched in a nearby woods. Decades ago, the site was cleared and built over. A historical marker explains how Frank was lynched on August 17, 1915, after his controversial conviction, and decades later, his posthumous pardon. On the anniversary of the lynching, people gather to remember and to recite the Jewish prayer of mourning. Amen. Nearby, a black granite slab reads, "In respectful memory of the thousands across America denied justice by lynching, victims of hatred, prejudice, and ignorance between 1880 and 1946. Approximately 570 Georgians were lynched." It was installed by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation, and Rabbi Stephen Lebo, formerly senior rabbi at Temple Kol Emeth in Marietta.
Let us be clear. Leo Frank is the only Jew we know of who was lynched in America. But the black community suffered disproportionately the scourge of lynching. From the 1880s to the 1940s, over 500 black men were lynched just in Georgia alone. Over 500 African Americans were murdered by mob violence. So when we come together to remember Leo Frank, let us always take a moment to reflect on the tremendous loss that the black community endured for so many years.
The monument is believed to be the only memorial in Georgia that addresses all lynchings in the state. It reflects a tragic chapter of Georgia and Southern history that still clings to the collective conscience.
The lynching of Leo Frank, just across the street there, by a group of prominent community leaders, is part of the Murder and Mayhem section of the History with Chutzpah exhibit at the William Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum in Atlanta. I'm Audrey Galix, Community Engagement Director of the AIB Network. AIB is proud to partner with the Bremen Museum to bring you a taste of history with Chutzpah. Some of the stories, but not all, from the exhibit. And in this edition of our program, we'll bring you stories of troubling times, murder and mayhem, but also stories of hope and survival.
A door with a broken pane of glass and a set of keys are among the artifacts that tell the story of the lynching of Leo Frank in the History with Chutzpah exhibit. So are two pairs of baby shoes and a pair of portraits of two sets of siblings. Generally, one might find a tender warmth looking at their faces and shoes. Instead, these simple items help tell the story of one of the most notorious cases in Georgia legal history, disturbing and morbidly fascinating, and one of the most heinous crimes in American Jewish history. The year, 1913, Confederate Memorial Day, less than 50 years since the Civil War. A 13-year-old girl by the name of Mary Fagan, who worked at the National Pencil Company in Atlanta, went to pick up her pay. Sandy Berman, along with Jane Levy, curated the History with Chutzpah exhibit that includes a number of artifacts that tell the story of her murder, the trial, and the lynching of Leo Frank.
The National Pencil Company manufactured pencils, obviously, and was owned by the Montag family here in Atlanta, and also one of the principal shareholders was a man by the name of Moses Frank. He was a Confederate veteran and he was living in Atlanta, and he had a nephew by the name of Leo Frank.
Uncle Moses Frank invited Leo to come down to Atlanta to work in the factory. Leo was a Cornell grad and was sent to Germany to learn the business. At 25, he moved to Atlanta from New York, got involved in the Jewish community, met Lucille Seelig, married her, and became the pencil factory's superintendent.
Leo is the last person who admits to seeing Mary Fagan alive. In the early morning hours the next day, her body is discovered by the night watchman, Newt Lee. That's the beginning of the trial and tribulation that beset Leo Frank.
Mary Fagan had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The mesh purse carrying her $1.20 pay was missing. Several people were arrested: Jim Connolly, the janitor, Newt Lee, the night watchman, and Leo Frank. Only Frank was indicted, based on Connolly's testimony.
Jim Connolly had been seen washing out a bloody shirt or something that looked like blood, and he said it was just rust.
Connolly swore he was Frank's accomplice. He told authorities he'd carried Mary Fagan's body to the basement, placing it into the elevator shaft. The Atlanta Journal ran an illustration based on Connolly's testimony during the trial. Murder notes left at the scene were proven to have been written by Connolly, but he claimed Frank had dictated them. The trial began with Connolly the key witness.
The entire defense rests on whether or not the defense attorneys can break Jim Connolly on the witness stand, but they can't. He sticks to his story.
The jury, seen here in a photo included in the exhibit, convicted Frank in record time and sentenced him to death. People who'd gathered outside the courtroom cheered the guilty verdict. During the trial, many had shouted, "Hang the Jew." Frank's multiple appeals in 1914 and 1915 were denied. A diary from his time in Fulton County Jail in the exhibit recounts the routine of his time behind bars, as his fate lie in the hands of Governor John M. Slayton, who studied the case and commuted the sentence to life in prison.
He's worried about the crowd, he's worried about vigilantism, so he sends Leo at night on a train to Milledgeville, to the prison farm there, to get him out of harm's way. And that's where Leo is when the pardon is, or the commutation is announced. Riots all throughout the city. They storm the governor's mansion. It's the only time in this country's history that the National Guard had to be called out to protect a sitting governor. Slayton leaves the state for his own protection, and Leo is at the prison farm.
In the Milledgeville prison farm, another prisoner slashed Frank's throat. Frank survived.
While this is all going on, the elite of Marietta, the people who, the attorneys, an ex-governor, a judge, are all conspiring with the Prison and Parole Board to take Leo out of the Milledgeville prison, drive him back to Marietta and lynch him. But once his throat is slashed, they think, well, maybe we won't have to carry out our plan.
When they learned that Frank was expected to live, that bloodthirsty mob of Marietta's elite drove to the prison farm.
And without a shot being fired, are able to remove Leo from his, he's actually not in a cell, he's in the infirmary behind the warden's office recuperating. We have the door here on display that separated the warden's office from the infirmary that was opened without a shot being fired again.
Frank was driven back to Marietta and lynched. In 1982, in his 80s, a conscience-stricken Alonzo man who had been Leo Frank's office boy issued a confession. Conley had threatened to kill him if he told the truth, that he had seen Conley with Mary Fagan's body and knew Conley had committed the murder. Conley was never tried and died in 1962. And no one was ever charged with Frank's lynching. In 1986, Leo Frank was granted a posthumous pardon.
But they did not address the question of guilt or innocence, only that the state of Georgia had failed to protect Leo Frank.
The Leo Frank case unveiled some sad truths about the South, including lingering regional hostilities from the Civil War and Reconstruction. Frank's case and ultimate lynching had made local and national front-page news. You can read all about it in the exhibit. The Leo Frank trial also exposed racial and cultural inequalities, socioeconomic ills like child labor, the horror of lynching, and to the shock of many Southern Jews, anti-Semitism.
They were, well respected. They were members of the Jewish community, had run for political office. In 1870, Aaron Haas had been elected mayor pro tem of the city of Atlanta. Believe it or not, he was a founding member of the Piedmont Driving Club, one of the first and last Jews for a very long time to be a member of the Piedmont Driving Club.
But in the wake of the trial and lynching, it became a frightening time to be Jewish.
Once the sentence was commuted from death to life in prison, Jewish businesses in Marietta were boycotted. Jews left. A number of them bought weapons for their own protection. Herbert Schiff, who was the assistant at the pencil factory and who was a witness at the trial, bought a weapon, a pistol, because he feared for his own life. And a lot of people left and never returned. So it was a real undercurrent throughout the trial.
And while Frank's lynching inspired the reorganization of the Ku Klux Klan, and while many Jews would not speak of it, the case also became a catalyst for confronting anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry.
It encouraged the Jewish community to never be silent again about acts against one of their own. The Anti-Defamation League was already founded in 1913, but the Leo Frank case became its cause célèbre, and it used that to continue its fight for not just members of the Jewish community, but for everybody who are victims of the miscarriage of justice, like Leo Frank was.
Ironically, lingering fears from the Leo Frank case were smoothed over by the October 1958 bombing here at the Temple, Atlanta's oldest Jewish congregation. It was even likened to the bomb that healed. Thankfully, no one was killed or injured in the blast, and although it did extensive damage to the building, the sanctuary was spared.
The mayor immediately went to the temple and stood with Rabbi Rothschild. President Eisenhower made a statement about the temple bombing in support of the temple. There was just an outpouring of support everywhere.
Newspaper articles from the temple bombing in Atlanta are in the exhibit, as is a fragment from the damaged temple building. 5 suspects were arrested. One of them, George Bright, was tried twice. One trial ending in a hung jury, the second with an acquittal. Bright had openly taunted the temple's rabbi, Rabbi Jacob Rothschild. He had been an early and vocal advocate of civil rights and integration. The temple in Atlanta was also far from the only worship community attacked. In March of 1960, at Temple Beth Israel in Gadsden, Alabama, a young man armed with a firebomb and a rifle shot and injured several congregants. It's said he was inspired by Nazi ideology. He died shortly after the attack in a car accident. There was never a trial. Meantime, a contemporary show of Chutzpah aims to right a historic wrong in the name of Leo Frank.
How hard is it to clear the name of an innocent man? Now, some people will ask us, why do this type of service? Isn't the time past for Frank's exoneration? And the answer is, justice has no shelf life. There's no statute of limitations on doing the right thing. And some will ask, why do this service? How does it actually affect us? And the answer is, you can only make the future good if you're willing to make the past right. Finally, some people will say, why even bring up Frank's name again after 110 years? Who cares about the anti-Semitism that long ago? And the answer to that is quite simple. We Jews have long memories. You see, we Jews suffer from many diseases. It's just that amnesia isn't one of them.
That the History with Chutzpah exhibit addresses challenging topics like murder and mayhem proves the point. Never again, never forget.
Ever since the Holocaust, the expression "never again" has become the outcry of the Jewish people in the face of genocide. From 1933 to 1945, during World War II, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler systematically murdered 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the European Jewish population. The Nazis also murdered at least 5 million Soviet prisoners of war, Romani, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and others. The Bremen Museum has a permanent wing devoted to telling the story of the roots of that evil, along with the stories of those who perished and those who survived the unspeakable. So you might not think that a double deck of playing cards, a teddy bear, a drawstring bag could help tell the story of the Nazi Holocaust, but they do, along with crates and suitcases. They are examples of chutzpah, of hope and survival. The playing cards were donated to the Bremen by Paula Bienstock-Arbieser from Poland, hidden with her mother and older sister by their Polish housekeeper and nanny, Frania.
During the war, she worked as a maid, and one of the homes she cleaned was for the Gestapo agent who was occupying the home next to hers. And the children during the day had to remain totally quiet, and the mother, and they could not say anything. They had very little to do. They had some writing paper. Paula kept a small diary, but they were really, there was nothing that they could do during the day. And for years, Paula would come in. She would always speak to our tour groups, and I would say, "Don't you have anything else you can give to the museum from that time?" And I would be always like nagging her, and she would always say, "I don't have anything, stop asking me." And then one day, she walked into my office, and she was so excited, and I said, she hands me this double deck of playing cards, and in a leather case, and I go, "What's this?" She goes, "I opened an old suitcase and I found these cards, and I remembered that Frania had given them to us. She stole them out of the man who worked for was in the Gestapo. She stole them out of his home while she was cleaning there to bring to us children so we would have cards to play with during the day."
Behind the stolen playing cards is a story of courage and chutzpah, which Paula Arbieser described in a 1996 oral history interview.
And this is how she saved our life, not to arise suspicious that she has somebody. She would, for example, invite a neighbor. She would put my mother into a closet, and my sister and myself, we were so little that we could fit into a box. And she would cover the box, and she would invite a neighbor, and she would say, "Do you think that the room needs painting?" Just to show her that nobody was there. And of course, after 10 minutes, she had to take the woman out, because we would choke her in the box. But we never heard a bad word from her. She never said that she regretted, that she's scared. She said she was very religious woman. She was a Catholic, and she believed that God will help her to save us.
The teddy bear in the History with Chutzpah exhibit illustrates the story of then 6-year-old Sophie Rosenbaum. She was on the last Kindertransport out of Austria in 1939 and sent to England. The Kinder, or Children's Transport, was an organized rescue operation of unaccompanied children from Nazi-controlled territory in the last years before the outbreak of World War II. Some 10,000 children, the vast majority of them Jewish, were saved and sent to the United Kingdom.
And we have her travel pictures, her passport pictures that her grandson donated. And in one of the little passport pictures that would end up being clipped for the passport, one of them she's holding the bear. And then when he had the bear and could donate that as well, it was just remarkable. And it just tells the story about, again, a small little child traveling alone, getting out of the hands of the Nazis.
Benjamin Hirsch, who became an award-winning Atlanta architect, was 6 years old when he and his 2 older siblings were sent by their mother out of Frankfurt, Germany, on the last Kindertransport to Paris in 1938. His father was among some 30,000 Jewish men rounded up and imprisoned by the Nazis on Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. Of reference to the nights of November 9th and 10th, when the Nazis unleashed mobs in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia to attack Jews, Jewish businesses, and synagogues. In an oral history interview in 1995, Benjamin Hirsch recalls what he witnessed.
It was a horrendous experience, actually. I stood there watching, and there were many people there. And half of them about were just as stunned as Arno and I were, just watching what was going on, watching these hoodlums running in and out, bringing out artifacts and bringing in more inflammable material and trying to burn the place down. And the other half of the people were actually cheering them on as if they were at a soccer game or football game. There were policemen that were there, and at first when we saw the policemen there, we felt good about it, thinking they were going to put a stop to everything. And then we realized they were there to protect the vandals, the people who were there to destroy the synagogue.
Hirsch and his siblings were resettled in foster homes in Atlanta in 1941. When he was 16, he learned that his father, mother, and his two younger siblings, too young to join the Kindertransport, had been murdered by the Nazis. Charlotte Dreyfus was also among those children saved by the Kindertransport. She was 14 when she arrived in Georgia. The exhibit includes heart-wrenching correspondence with her parents, imprisoned in a transit camp in France, and her attempts to rescue them. She wrote, "They asked me to send them food, and they begged me to do everything in my power to get them out of there." The exhibit also includes the telegram informing her of her parents' death.
And of course, the big question is, what happened to your sister? Well, her sister survived. The French resistance had made a concerted effort to get some of these people out of the transit camps, and her sister was one of them. And she survived the war. They were reunited, and it was a happy ending to that story.
The Bremen had Charlotte's foster care case files and sent her that poignant correspondence.
So she had copies of every single letter. It was, and I asked her, I go, how was that for you? It was wonderful and it was horrible all at the same time. To be able to see the letters from her parents and her sister, and know that she wasn't able to save them, but also to see and hear her parents' words again after all those years.
A pair of boots worn by a German soldier are also in the display. Along with his photo, the boots tell the story of Chutzpah demonstrated by a young, resourceful Jacob Kahan.
His entire family was murdered very early, and he was sent to a series of camps. And he described himself in his interview as, he said, today there are street kids. He goes, I could describe myself as a camp kid, because I just knew the ins and outs of these camps. I always took an outside job because I wanted to see trouble coming. And I decided early on that I would steal food because I didn't want to starve to death, and I'd rather be shot for stealing food than end up going to the gas chambers. So he was young, and he was old enough to work.
Because he could work, Kahan was sent to a series of camps. Toward the war's end, he was sent to Bergen-Belsen. He managed to escape by crawling through a sewer.
He gets picked up by British troops, which is why the photograph we have in the case behind me, he's dressed in a British uniform. And the British, when they picked him up, allowed him to ride along. It was very much toward the end of the war. They were liberating the camps, and they were capturing Nazis and SS soldiers and officers, and they allowed people like Jacob to exact some revenge on some of their captives. And he did. He was allowed to take some revenge on some of the people that the soldiers that they captured. And he said in his interview that he always thought of them as superhuman. But when he was hitting them, beating them, he realized that they were human beings just like he was.
As the exhibit program notes, scuffed and worn trunks and a suitcase represent the resilience of their owners, those who survived the ghettos, forced labor, and concentration camps to build new lives in the South. Perhaps among the most poignant reminders of that resilience is a drawstring bag worn by a little girl named Eva, a child who traveled alone after the war to meet up with her mother, who survived a labor camp in Hungary. If that isn't a show of chutzpah, what is?